Hey everyone, welcome back to Dev Parkour. In this video, I'm going to talk about something that I really love to hate talking about, which is SAML. Let's see, this is Simple Authentication Markup Language, Simple Secure Authentication Markup Language. I don't remember. It's some acronym, SAML. If you've used it before, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and if you've never used it before and don't know what I'm talking about, consider yourself lucky. It is one of the most painful authentication schemes to use and get right, probably in the world. Um, uh, Now, why do people use it? If it's so painful to get right, why do people use it? Well, it's also one of the most secure authentication uh, setups that you can use. And that's why it's still being used, is because it's so secure. It's once you get it right, it is possibly the most secure. Even though the authentication tokens or the authentication payload that it creates doesn't hit every point on my list of what makes an authentication token secure. I'll leave a link to that in the video description. That video that was last week or the week before. Even though it doesn't hit every single bullet point on my list, it is still by far probably the most secure way of doing authentication. Basically, it's two post requests, and it does use the browser, but it is a payload constructed on the server, then sent to the browser. The browser is forced to do a post request, usually using JavaScript or by submitting a form somehow, um, with this payload to a another URL on an identity provider. And this payload is an XML document that, if it's set up properly, if it's set up with the in the recommended way, it is encrypted with a private key. So it uses asymmetric key cryptography. It is encrypted, not encoded. It is actually encrypted with a private key that's known only to the service provider. But previously, the public key has been uploaded to the identity provider. So when that post request goes across, the identity provider decrypts the XML payload with the public key, gets a bunch of information from it, validates the application that originally sent the request, and if the application is known to the identity provider, it provides a login prompt to the user. User enters their username and password. So just like with OAuth 2, the username and password are never entered into the service provider, only to the identity provider. User enters username and password, clicks login, clicks submit, whatever the button is. That post request goes back to the IDP, so we're still on the IDP. IDP validates this against its internal database of usernames and passwords. If everything checks out, it creates a new XML payload. This XML payload includes a series of claims, including potentially username, email address, user ID, AD, that's Active Directory username, um, any other information about the user. And depending on your configuration, you can specifically say, I want X, Y, and Z claim to come back in the payload. This is all in the initial configuration of the service provider on the identity provider. So one of the ways that SAML increases this security is it requires a significant amount of setup initially, to basically say this service provider is allowed to use this identity provider, and this identity provider knows about this service provider. So they both know about each other, and that is established right off the bat in order before any authentication can take place. Whereas with OAuth 2, you can basically stand up a new application, and the applications can say, okay, I want to use Google for authentication, and I think all that's required is you have to create a record, an application record in Google. You get a little number, and that's what identifies the application to the to the Google authentication system. In SAML, it is an extensive XML document that says this is what the service provider is. This is how the service provider works. And similarly, there's an XML document that you download from the identity provider and provide to the service provider so that they know about each other. So anyway, we're back on the identity provider. We've entered our username and password. We've clicked submit. Identity provider creates this XML document and puts in a bunch of claims. Now there are a few different ways to set up SAML. One way is that you can encrypt the individual claims. Another way is that you can sign the individual claims. Another way is that you can encrypt the entire payload. I think the recommendation is that you encrypt the entire payload. That's the way I've always used it because that seems to be the most secure to me. Another thing to watch out for is there is a way that when the IDP signs or encrypts the claims or the payload, it is using asymmetric key cryptography, again, just like when we sent the payload over to the IDP. It uses its private key, just like the service provider did when it used its private key to encrypt the payload before sending it to the IDP, which then used the corresponding public key to decrypt it. IDP encrypts the response payload with a private key that is known only to the IDP. So in some cases, the IDP will include the public key with the response that comes back. There is nothing of a sensitive nature in this response, so that by itself is not a security vulnerability. What is a security vulnerability is if you use that public key in your service provider to actually validate the contents of that payload. Yes, you will get the information from the payload, but there is nothing stopping someone, a malicious actor, from creating a payload and signing it or encrypting it with a private key that they know, and then sending it to you with the corresponding public key. That's fine. They know the public key. That's not an issue. If you use the public key that came in that payload, you are basically trusting whoever sent it to you. That is not okay. You want to use a public key. It should be the public key that corresponds to the private key that the IDP used, but you want to use a public key that you have saved during that initial setup process. And that is why SAML is so secure, is because you have shared a public key from service provider over here, identity provider over here. They each have created a public key that is, they're saying, this is the public key that corresponds to the private key I will use to sign and encrypt my stuff. They have exchanged that key through manual configuration, and now service provider can decrypt, or at the very least validate, all of the information coming from the IDP using something that it says, this is what the IDP said that I should use to encrypt all this stuff. So, at the beginning of time, when we first set everything up, this is the public key that I should be using. But in that payload, it doesn't really matter if the public key is there. I think that's there mainly for debugging because, let's be honest, giant XML payload with a bunch of encrypted stuff, not the easiest to inspect. I've had to do this, not the easiest to inspect just by itself. But if you don't have that private key, or if you don't have that public key, and you're downloading a SAML packet to your local machine, it's useful to be able to use that that public key information to figure out what's in there and see if it's got the right stuff, because that could be an issue, right? You want to be able to debug these things in isolation. So one issue might be that you're not using the right key and therefore decryption fails. Okay, that's one thing. But if decryption is good, it's a lot easier to just use the key that's being provided and try to decrypt some of this information rather than try to extract the key from your service provider application, and that'd be a whole mess. So in any event, that packet, that encrypted XML goes back to the service provider. Service provider is able to decrypt it, again, using the public key that it got previously from the IDP. And then all of that information there can be trusted because you've used certificates to A, ensure that it was secured, it was encrypted going across the wire, so it hasn't been tampered with. And B, you've used the certificate to validate that it came from a trusted identity provider, a trusted source. So it only needs one request response cycle, or kind of meta request response cycle, and it all happens on the front channel. So it doesn't need any back channel communication to verify that information. Again, really difficult to set up, really difficult to get right, but when you do, it is probably by far the most secure scenario you could possibly have. And at that point, the user is authenticated. The user's gone through the authentication flow. You can do anything the user is allowed to do. Now, the one thing that doesn't provide, SAML is specifically an authentication process. It doesn't do authorization, though there are extensions to SAML that do authorization. It doesn't provide you with an access token. You should create your own access token at the service provider endpoint, and then use that to as part of the session, whether you use an actual HTTP session or whatever. But that's kind of on you. That's on the session provider, the service provider, and to deal with. So I know that was a lot, and I know there were no visuals. It's just my hands. So hopefully that still made sense. If it did and you liked it and found it interesting, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. If you like these videos and are excited for what I'm about to do, I'm actually about to build my own authentication system, kind of demoing all of this. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel and click that notification bell so you'll be notified when those videos come out. If you have thoughts, comments, questions, go ahead and leave them down in the comment section below. I will respond to them as soon as I can. And thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.